Hi students, and welcome back to Biological Anthropology. I'm your instructor, Christina Augsburger, and today in our lecture we're going to be looking at human variation. We're continuing on some of the work that you did last week and expanding on that. So in this lecture I'm just covering a few things just to make sure we are on track and to give you a little bit more detail about some of the concepts that are in your textbook. I'm not going into all the details. There's a lot of information in your textbook and the authors do a pretty good job of laying out that information for you. But I do want to briefly touch on some of the issues from chapters 13 and 14 that we've been working on for this week and last week. So we're going to briefly talk about the field of population genetics and how it can help us understand human variation and explore that. So we're moving beyond those archaic concepts of race that are inadequate to understand variation. And we're going to be using another concept called the polymorphism. So we're going to define what a polymorphism is and use the example of lactose tolerance and sickle cell anemia to get a better idea of polymorphisms. We're also going to be thinking about how humans have responded to environmental stress through the lens of human evolutionary history and looking at populations today to try to understand this. We're going to also define and describe the idea of adaptation and adjustment and look at some examples of these as well. So let's dive in first to this idea of a polymorphism. So a polymorphism is one of these tools that we're going to be using when we're looking at populations and trying to understand how they vary today. And a polymorphism is simply when we see two or more clearly different phenotypes. So we've already discussed the ABO blood type system, so you can use that as an example. People might have the blood type A, the blood type B, the blood type AB, or the blood type O. And as you recall, that because there's three different alleles that we see in human populations. And we can map these phenotypes onto the geography of the earth to see where populations exist with more of one particular allele over another. So in this particular image here, I show you a map of the percent of the population that has O blood type, meaning they make no protein. And you can see we have these clines. A cline is simply that distribution over geographical space. So if you want to understand sort of a clinal model, you want to think about the fact that we will often have sort of general gradual changes in gene frequency as we move sort of into the boundaries of different areas due to the simple fact that there's chance mating going on at the edges of geographical regions. But then again, people who have lived in one area for thousands of generations are more likely to share genetically inherited traits than people who, move out of that area. Today, obviously, people move around a lot. We have less cultural restrictions on who can marry whom. And interestingly enough, people still end up having children with people who live have children with people who have lived fairly close to them. So it is still quite unusual to have your mate come from very far away. So the clinal model doesn't give us distinct groups or races. Again, this sort of disrupts that idea that there are races. Instead, it shows that there are sort of populations where people tend to have similar genetic frequencies or allele frequencies. So let's look at an example here of lactose tolerance. And this is going to be an example where actually we can think about how culture and lifestyle is going to play a role in the selection for or selection against a particular genotype and therefore the phenotype. So lactose tolerance, as you know, is that ability to digest the sugars in milk as you age, as you get older. And humans can digest lactose, that sugar, because we produce an enzyme, lactase, when we are babies. So babies need to be able to drink milk from their mothers in order to survive infancy. However, most adults no longer produce that particular enzyme and therefore will have difficulty if they're drinking a lot of milk because milk has lactose in it. So if they drink too much milk, they might have bloating, gas, other digestive issues because their body is not breaking down that sugar in milk. Now, interestingly, lactose tolerance, the ability to drink milk and digest it properly as an adult, is actually less common in the world than lactose intolerance. So for those of you who can sit around and enjoy a big, bowl of cereal with a milk poured on it, you're actually in the minority. And when we look at a map of areas that have higher percentage of lactose tolerance, you're going to see that these areas are places where there was a greater percentage of people who were herding dairy animals for longer periods of times. So certain sections of East Africa, for example, have herded cattle for thousands and thousands of generations. Certain parts of the Middle East also relied on types of milk such as camel and as well as goat milk. And so these areas where there was the use of these dairy animals, if you had the ability to digest lactose as an adult, it gave you an advantage if there was some kind of environmental change. So if there was a period where there was less food sources available and you could drink the milk from these animals, which also meant you did not have to slaughter your animal and eat it, you could get nutrients from the milk, you would have a greater fitness, reproductive fitness. So you could actually bear more children, and therefore the likelihood of that particular genetic combination to be in the population would increase. So they would be able to pass down this trait, this genetic ability, because they could have more offspring, because they could survive those periods of environmental stress by utilizing something in their culture, and that was the dairy. So in areas where there were no dairy animals and farming and or keeping pastoralist types of traditions where you keep these types of animals, where those didn't exist, there would not be an advantage to being able to digest milk as an adult because that milk was not there in the culture, was not present in their particular diet. So as you can see on this map, lactose intolerance is quite high in some places, lactose tolerance in other places. Okay. Sometimes we can also look at polymorphisms and see that they are balanced. So in the case with lactose intolerance and tolerance, the environment pushed one of these alleles or these particular genotypes to be more prevalent. In the case of sickle cell anemia, sometimes you'll have an allele in a population that's not being selected for or against, and instead it remains in the population. We call that a balanced polymorphism. So using the example of sickle cell anemia, we can explore this idea. Now, sickle cell anemia is caused by it is genetic, and it's caused by a recessive allele. And if you get this, let me see if I said that right. And if you inherit, hang on one second. If you inherit two of the recessive alleles, then your hemoglobin, instead of being nice and round and floating down your blood vessels, like, bumping off of the walls of a cave, you have these sickled shape hemoglobin, and they tend to clump together. Sounds not so good. And in fact, if someone is diagnosed with sickle cell anemia, they do have a lower life expectancy. In the US, we do have good treatments for this, so people can have treatments and live a longer life. However, the life expectancy is shortened, and in places where there is less chances to get good health care, the life expectancy is much greatly reduced. Okay, so sickle cell anemia is caused by an allele. You receive 2 of those alleles because it's you have to have both of those recessive alleles for this to be present. In some places, sickle cell anemia remains in a population, even though sickle cell anemia is not something that is necessarily good for a person to have. And the reason for this is because people who are carriers for sickle cell anemia, meaning they have one of the good hemoglobin alleles and one of the bad hemoglobin alleles, actually have an advantage when malaria is present. So malaria is a disease borne by mosquitoes. So you get bit by a mosquito, and then you can suffer from malaria. Malaria can cause diarrhea. It can cause you to lose vast amounts of water, so you become dehydrated quickly, and you can actually die from malaria. Not good. You can get malaria more than once. Malaria has some treatments for it, but it does cause a great number of deaths throughout the world. So in places where you have a lot of these mosquitoes that are carrying malaria, you are at an advantage if you've received one of the good hemoglobin alleles and one of the bad hemoglobin alleles. You are a carrier for sickle cell anemia, but you do not have sickle cell. So that means that you now have an advantage for being heterozygous, for having 2 different alleles for this particular hemoglobin. If you have 2 of the recessive alleles, you have sickle cell, and your life expectancy is going to reduce. So you'll have a reduced reproductive fitness, or less fitness, right? If you have 2 of the good alleles in places where malaria is present, now you have a chance of dying from malaria and therefore having reduced fitness. So the ones who have the best fitness in that case are the carriers, and therefore they're going to be passing on this bad allele to some of their children. And in fact, in some African populations, you'll find this bad allele is as high as 40%, because it did provide an advantage for people with living in these areas that had a great deal of malaria. So it kept this allele in here. So the environment, the presence of malaria, helped retain this allele in those populations, even though you would think that would be an allele that the population should not want to have around. So too many good alleles, bad. Too many bad alleles, bad. That heterozygous advantage comes from having one of each of the alleles. Now, the example of sickle cell anemia and the example of lactose tolerance are both 2 examples of ways that humans have responded to environmental stress over time. So I want you to look a little bit at these adaptations and adjustments. So your book talks about genetic changes as being adaptation. So a way that over time we have selection for or against particular alleles. So genetic change can be understood as a biological response that takes place over many, many generations through natural selection. Then there are 3 types of adjustments that your book looks at. We have developmental adjustment, acclimatization, and cultural practices and technology, which your book calls behavioral adjustment. These 3 do not include genetic change. They are changes in your phenotype, but not in your genotype. And a simple change in your phenotype cannot be inherited. So let's look at some of the examples of these adjustments. Developmental adjustment refers to changes that occur as a human is developing in their lifetime. So during your lifetime, you're going to have adjustments to the environment. So for example, during World War II, in Europe, there was a lack of good food and healthy food. It was an awful environment. So as children who were born in World War II grew up, they tended to be fairly short. That next generation that was born post-war, after Reconstruction in Europe, the children tended to be quite a bit taller than their parents, because now they were able to access much better nutrition. That is a type of a developmental adjustment. Your nutrition changes in your lifetime, it's going to affect how you develop. The same thing could be witnessed in Japan as well. As after World War II, the protein intake was able to be increased for the general population. The general height of Japanese actually increased. Does this mean there was a genetic change for the Japanese? No, it simply was a change in their nutrition, allowing them to sort of reach their genetic potential in a sense. So those are positive developmental adjustments. Negative developmental adjustment can also happen. Kwashiorkor is an example of this. It's a type of malnutrition that it can occur in places where children do not have adequate minerals and other vitamins, and possibly where women are unable to breastfeed, especially if they've had an additional child. And kwashiorkor results in a child having sort of this extended belly because of the malnutrition, very thin limbs, sometimes the hair falls out, the skin can actually lose pigmentation because their body no longer has the proper vitamins and minerals to make these. Kwashiorkor can be reversed to some extent if that child is then provided with additional nutrients. But if it is allowed to exist for too long, that child will then have other growth issues, health problems as they get older, also possibly some developmental issues because their brain was not getting enough nutrition either. So this is developmental adjustment happening in a person's lifetime. It's not genetic. Another example to look at here is, or another way to think about this is by looking at some types of environmental stress. And one thing I want to point out is that when we're looking at human populations, what we're really looking at is a combination of all 4 of those responses. So you're going to see places, people have had genetic changes occur over time, so adaptations. There will be developmental adjustment, there'll be culture and technology, and there will also be acclimatization. Let me talk about how environments have affected some different populations. So Bergman was a German biologist who in 1847 observed that body size is larger in colder climates to conserve body temperature, especially in warm-blooded animals. So you think about a polar bear, for example. Polar bear has a large bulk mass to help keep it warm in that cold climate. So they're not lean and lanky like a giraffe. They're more compact and sort of a slightly larger body size. Think about it. When you're cold, you pull yourself together. Allen's rule is another observation that came a little bit later by an American biologist, and so he took this idea even farther and said that, well, if you look in warmer climates, warm-blooded animals will also have limbs that are longer relative to body size to help dissipate the body heat than warm-blooded animals in cold climates. So again, think about this. You're in a very hot climate. You're sweaty. What are you going to do? You're going to stretch your body out to expose as much body parts as you can so that that sweat can cool you off. As a breeze goes by, you feel cooler versus being all tucked together in a hot place. You'll just feel even hotter. So this is a kind of adaptation that can occur to environmental stress. People in colder regions, like the Inuit in sort of circumpolar regions, tend to be shorter and stockier. People like the Maasai, who are from Eastern Africa, tend to be tall and have long, lean limbs. Part of that is genetic. Part of that is also their developmental adjustment based on the diet that they eat as children and growing up as they're developing. Part of that is also cultural, what people favor in a mate, and sexual selection. So remember, there's not just one answer to why populations are different. You can also look at high altitude as an example of ways that people adapt to the environment. Your textbook looks at the Andean, the Tibetan, and the Ethiopian populations to try to see how each of those populations have a variety of adjustments that help them deal with living in high altitude areas. So there's not just one way that people have adapted or adjusted to living in high altitude. And if you think about it, right, when you go up into a high altitude, your body has to adjust to the thinner oxygen. So if you're going to be climbing Mount Everest, you first go up to a base camp where you try to adjust your body to that lack of oxygen before you attempt to climb up even farther. And then, of course, you're too high up, you're going to need additional oxygen. Athletes will train at higher altitudes because they have to push their body harder to be successful when they're in those higher altitudes. So especially athletes like skiers and things like that, they want to train at altitude, high altitudes, to push their body. Now, all the advantage of going up to a high altitude and training there can be fairly quickly lost when you return back to your usual altitude, but that adjustment is there for a time period. So be sure and read about adjustment to altitude in the acclimatization section in your book. Okay, last thing, just reviewing this from last week, is thinking about how people react and respond to the sun as an environmental stressor. So we've got the environment. It's the sun, the UV rays that you learned about last week. And as Nina Jablonski pointed out, how many UVB rays, or the strength of those UV rays, depends where you are on the earth. Thinking about skin color too, there is a range of categories. They are not discrete categories. So those idea of trying to classify people using this concept of race is not useful when we're really studying human variation. And if you think about it, a person's skin color is affected primarily by melanin, but also by hemoglobin. The sex, males tend to be have darker pigmentation because of the sex hormones. And people also sort of change color over time to some degree, again, to some degree. So your body is responding in different ways to the environment, and this is affecting your skin tone. Looking at it on a long-term genetic perspective, we can see that there are advantages to having darker skin when populations lived in areas with high UV, and there were advantages to having lighter skin in places where there was less UV. So if you have lighter skin, the advantage is you're going to go and you live in a very northern place where there's less UV. You go outside for a little while, your body can synthesize enough vitamin D from the sun to help keep you healthy. Disadvantage, if you go to a place where there's a lot of UV, you're going to sunburn quite easily. Not comfortable, eventually can develop into skin cancer, and even worse, this UV is going to break down the folate in your skin. Okay. Darker pigmentation or darker color of skin has an advantage in very sunny, high UV areas. It helps filter out those UV rays, protecting the folate. Wonderful, protects your folate. You have an advantage. You're able to reproduce more successfully. Think about this. Pregnant women are told to take folic acid. That's a type of folate. You need that for cell division, mitosis. And when do you really need mitosis? Especially when you are growing a baby, right? So if you're growing a baby, it's just a series of mitosis over and over and over again. So without enough folate in a body, a woman may have difficulty getting pregnant, staying pregnant, and carrying a baby to full term without some issues. So folate is extremely important in reproductive success, and that's fitness. It can also, a lack of folate can also affect sperm as well. So for men, it has can cause issues as well. On the inverse side, having a darker skin tone, if you move into those areas where there is less UV rays, you're not going to be getting enough vitamin D from the sun simply by going outside for a shorter period. So you can see there are these two big factors here, folate and vitamin D, that are contributing towards that selection for or against a particular skin tone. The environmental stress that's occurring is the amount of UV rays. And it's the two factors it pulls on are folate and vitamin D synthesis. In general, in the last two chapters, what I've really wanted you to understand is that when we are studying human variation and human diversity, we are looking at a combination of things. We have adaptation, adjustment, migration, the ability to move. Humans are moving all the time. I mean, we're practically going to Mars. And we have the environment. And so as these things work together, we have to keep these factors in mind to understand how people vary individually and how populations vary as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this section, and I will see you next week.